Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. We know this is a challenging area of development, and it's really important to have great minds addressing it. So thank you all very much for coming. Some of you will have expected to see AD's CEO, Tim Wainwright, in the role that I'm now playing. And unfortunately, because of a bereavement, he's not able to be here. He will be here tomorrow, so if anybody particularly would like to see him, please let me know. My name is Claire McEwen. I'm one of the directors of ADD International, and I'll explain a little bit what ADD is in a minute. I'm going to be taking over temporarily from Tim when Tim moves to WaterAid as CEO at the end of this week. So I will be following up, I hope, on some of the things that arise from this session. I wanted to start just with a few very practical things, because otherwise I'll probably forget them. So please turn your mobiles to silent. And when you are speaking in the sessions later, if you want to say something, please make sure to wait until somebody gives you a microphone, because this session is being recorded, and without a microphone, it won't be. And at the end of the session, please take a few minutes to fill in the slip that is in your seats, and I'll remind you about that later. I also wanted to draw your attention to some short booklets that are on the table that would give you some additional reading from this session. And to mention, and I will mention it again, that there will be a follow-up session. Somebody called it a deep dive over lunch, and that is going to be in West Wing, Dining Room 2. And you can get your lunch in West Wing Dining Room 1 before that session. And that is really a time where we could perhaps take some of the ideas that emerge from this morning's session a bit further. And that runs from 12 until 1:15. So if I can just say a few words about AD International before I introduce the speakers, whose names you did have up on the board. AD has been around for 30 years. It's an organisation that works principally in East Africa and in Bangladesh and Cambodia. It describes itself as an ally to the disability movement, and it works principally with organisations of persons with disabilities, supporting them to work more effectively, to claim their rights, both in terms of access to services and in terms of voice and accountability within their own environments. And you'll learn a little bit more about AD, particularly through some of the comments that Joseph Walugembe, our Uganda country director, who is sitting next to me, will say to you. We also have on the panel several people who have been very closely involved with the research that this session has come out of, and Jim will be explaining a little bit more about that. But we have Rima up right at the end from SEWA, Jody from IDS, Carrie from DFID, and Joseph from AD. And I'm now going to hand over to Jim, who will explain a little more about how this all came about and about what we're going to do in this session. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, everybody. Great to have a nearly packed room on this really critical issue. As many of you in this room would probably be very aware, I think over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on how can you make markets work better for those living at the bottom of the economic pyramid, those living in extreme poverty. I think for many of us involved in that space, we see some of the potential, but sometimes there's also a degree of frustration about can you actually achieve change at scale? Can you really, through market approaches, really have the impact on people's lives that one might hope? Many of you might know the sort of language around making markets work for the poor, or market systems approaches, which essentially have tried to say how can you get sustainable solutions to poverty through using markets? How can you use markets to try and achieve impact at scale? How can you make market mechanisms much more inclusive to benefit everybody? So despite many of the successes I'm sure many of you would have seen and we've experienced in our own work, there still is 800 million people living in extreme poverty. And I guess one of the critical things to recognise about that is a very large proportion of that group also suffer various forms of marginalisation, whether it's through gender, ethnicity, disability, the geographic places where people live. So this sort of link between people living with marginalisation and living in extreme poverty are very, very entwined. And I guess trying to tackle and unpack this challenge is what led to a bit of research that sits behind today's event, but also to Rockefeller supporting a Bellagio discussion last year where we tried to unpack what are some of the challenges in this space and what are some of the future opportunities. We had a fascinatingly diverse group in Bellagio last year across all sorts of backgrounds and experiences, from impact investing, from the disability movement, from people working in market systems approaches. And I guess the final conclusion out of that was that, yes, there are tremendous market opportunities, but very often to make those market opportunities come to life, you need to think about the linkages to social movements. There's an awful lot of social support, social background that needs to go together to really unpack the opportunities for markets. And that led to a suggestion that really there needs to be a much greater, almost global effort, or we called it a call to action, about taking the experiences that we've had to date around market systems to have a much deeper impact on those living in marginalised circumstances at the bottom of the economic pyramid. So that's essentially the discussion we'd like to have with you today. How do you take this further? How do you achieve scale? How do you make things work really in practice at a local level? But how do we get the global level political support and buy-in and investment and support that's really needed to make a big difference in people's lives? So we're thrilled to have the four people on the panel today to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the discussions and issues behind this. How we'll run the session is first we'll have some 5-minute perspectives from each of the speakers. Then we're going to hand it over to you to have a little bit of a discussion at each of your table about some of your experiences and what you see as some of the opportunities. We'll then come back to a plenary discussion to hear what you're talking about, and then finally give our panellists a chance to give some final reflections. As Claire mentioned, there'll also be a chance over lunch for those of you who might like to talk with us in more detail about this topic. So again, thank you for being here. So with that, let me invite some perspectives from our panel. And first to you, Reema. I mean, I think for over 30 years now, you've been running an amazing organisation in India that I think has 2 million members, working a lot with women on economic empowerment. So what have been some of your experiences? What are some of the challenges? And what do you see as some of the opportunities? And perhaps you can sort of bring the reality of these challenges to life for us.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, namaste, brothers and sisters. And I will be speaking here on behalf of my 2 million sisters that I represent at the Self-Employed Women's Association. We were founded in Gujarat, but we work across the country and in the neighboring South Asian countries as well. And we at SEWA believe that poverty is also a form of violence with the consent of the society. And so I think we come together as poor, as women, as workers, and I think our fight is against poverty. How do we come together, organize collectively to fight poverty? So I think our goals are full employment and self-reliance for our members. And when I say women as workers in the informal economy in our country, 93% of the workforce is in the informal economy. So these are the poorest of the poor women working as vendors, as home-based workers working out of their homes, working on the farms as agriculture workers, forest workers, waste recyclers. And I think when I say our goals are full employment, it means work and income security. As our experience of over 4 decades shows that when women have work and income security, it brings economic security to the women, and then they are able to move out of poverty. So our approach has been that you build workers, that is our members' economic organizations. This may be in the form of small collectives, social enterprises, companies, for-profit, not-for-profit, associations, so that the women just don't remain workers or producers, but they also become the owners and managers of their own organizations as well. And I think it's not just organizing alone, but organizing brings the collective strength to the women. It builds their confidence that she's not alone, but there are thousands and thousands of women like her, and together we will be able to bring about the change that's needed. And with that we work on asset creation, so it may be in the form of small savings of the women or having access to tools and equipments, licenses to be in the mainstream of the market, working on capacity building, both leadership skills and managerial skills, and having access to basic support services, which is healthcare, childcare, nutrition and shelter. And when all these things come together at the pace at which the women as workers or as producers can take it, this in itself becomes an empowering process for the women. She's able to demand, she's able to speak up, and then there's no looking back. She gains the support from the camaraderie of other women that she sees in the movement as well. So I think the key for us is economic security that helps, that is being brought about by building members' own economic organizations. And we have, like, there are 25 different trades in which we have built members, but I just want to highlight that, you know, once you have the members' own economic organization, it helps them build the supply chain. And once your supply chain is in place, you are able to be in the mainstream market. And that only helps you bring viability, sustainability, and then helps you scale up. So today we have Seva Trade Facilitation Center, which has over 60,000 women artisans as its shareholders, the members, and it plugs to the mainstream supply chains of, you know, the Primarks of the world, the Gaps of the world, you know, to the large retail chain houses in the country as well and internationally as well. And we have replicated it in our neighboring countries. So we work in Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan, Myanmar and Bhutan as well. Likewise, we have our agribusiness initiative, which has its own brand called Rudy, and we partnered with Unilever to build a whole rural distribution network. And today we have around 250,000 small and marginal farmers. So I think this is the key that I would leave here. And the latest, I think, is that, you know, how do you bring in technology, which then, you know, excites the rural youth, so that a young educated girl or a boy in the village doesn't feel that because my parents were illiterate, or, you know, therefore they used to do the traditional occupations of farming or of, you know, artisanry. But how do you bring in technology so that they feel that it's a dignified job or a work? So I would leave it at this and then come back with a few lessons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rima. Jody, you helped to lead the research that sat behind the Bellagio event, and you looked at a range of different initiatives. I mean, what were some of the overall lessons that you learnt about this link between markets and social movements, and what are some of the challenges that you saw in terms of taking markets to scale to benefit these groups?
So in the research, there were about 22 examples we looked at in depth, and perhaps not surprisingly, what we didn't find is a blueprint of, you know, this is the way to do it. We identified 5 what we called entry points, and we found that all of the examples were using some combination of those entry points as the basis of the solution. And one of those entry points was around collective organization, collective action. So I'll say a bit more about that in this context. We had, if I look at a couple of the examples, we had a few examples from Seva, including Rudy. We had an example, Ciudad Saludable, which is one of the SCOL awardees here. And I'll pick up on two others that might be less familiar. The first is Srijan, which is a grassroots organization in India which is supporting the development of producer companies. So the producer company we looked at, Maitri Mahila, involved women who were generally uneducated and excluded from markets, partly on the basis of gender, but also often other aspects, for example, due to their caste. And Srijan worked by helping support initially self-help groups that allowed the women to accumulate savings, to start to acquire assets, to start micro-enterprises. Eventually, federations of self-help groups were developed. Women were supported to purchase buffalo. That eventually led to the development of a dairy value chain through local milk collection centres, through the creation of barefoot veterinarians, so basic veterinary services. And ultimately, in 2013, the Maitri Mahila Producer Company was established with 10 women as shareholders. Today, there's 500 women shareholders. A second example comes from Kenya, and this is supporting struggling micro-entrepreneurs to increase their income in a fairly isolated area in central Kenya. They are mostly rural peasant farmers. They also, some of them have small micro-enterprises, so shops, barbers, battery chargers. And World Vision's Social Entrepreneurship and Economic Development Unit supported development of community business councils, effectively micro-business associations in these areas. There were 5 groups, over 1,000 local business owners, and they were supported to organize and to develop collectively plans of how to tackle some of the barriers they were facing in terms of accessing markets, as well as some business coaching and helping to link to other resources, other business networks. And they've been able to increase access to finance, but also to improve the local roads. They've been able to reduce the costs of getting a single business permit and identify some new micro-franchising opportunities. And so what to take from these couple of examples, why does this collective approach help support market access? I mean, there are some things that are perhaps more obvious. Collective power within markets, increasing your bargaining power, advocacy to change the rules that are discriminating or not supporting the business. But the other two things, and Rima's already talked about it a little bit, is the development of leadership, the development of respect, the development of self-confidence was absolutely core. I think the second, and that translates beyond the initiative itself and into other spheres, into the household, into other areas of the community. And the other aspect is, through collective action, helping to insulate poor households against risks. Through the collective savings, for example, the risk that engaging in markets inevitably entails is in a context where there aren't perhaps insurance products or proper social protection. This is an important support, as well as to help individuals to be able to challenge social norms that are discriminating against them that they wouldn't perhaps be able to do on their own. So very briefly, 3 challenges for discussion. One is, how do we better support the leaders in these groups, the development of leadership? How do we help these groups to engage with others? What we're not trying to do is create isolated groups of very marginalized people, but helping to build linkages. And finally, how do we think about this? I mean, there are probably faster ways to increase market access, but the sort of story that Rima told, it really builds the foundation, it builds the stability, it builds the sustainability, it builds the credibility. And so it's really not about breakthrough technologies, thinking about Atul Gawande's presentation yesterday, but this is about systems innovation and how do we support that.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jodie. Kerry's responsible for disability policy in the DFID, the UK Department for International Development. Could you give us a more global perspective on this? If we think about the SDGs, if we think about the challenges of leaving nobody behind, where are we sitting globally? Why is this discussion important to broader global agendas, and how does DFID view these issues?
Sure, and I think in 2015, when the world agreed the Sustainable Development Goals, it was a really momentous occasion, because what those goals said was, we will finish the job of our predecessors. We will ensure that no one is left behind. No one is left behind. That's a really big ambition. And on the disability agenda, and I'll talk about the disability agenda because it's the one I'm closest to, the reality of the current action and investment to support inclusion of people with disabilities globally, and that ambition are so far apart. And that's why the UK has said we will lead and drive a global step change to ensure that people with disabilities are included in our work and indeed in all development efforts. But when we look to the future and how we can bridge the gap between that ambition and the reality, you know, ODA, official development assistance, has and will continue to be dwarfed by private capital investment. And clearly, while we've spent the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years looking at how markets can best serve the needs of the poorest people, there is still a huge way to go to make sure that those markets are reaching those people in extreme poverty. But the opportunities are really great. You know, markets provide even the world's poorest people with access to services, to products, with opportunities for employment. And they also, as Rima has said, can really tackle that stigma and discrimination. So I guess one of the questions I often ask myself, and one of the questions that came up in the Rockefeller meeting a lot, was what are those incentives that will drive markets to invest and think about people that are furthest behind? And what's the role of donors and the development community to set those incentives that help support markets to be able to invest in areas where they aren't currently, and to take that additional risk that might be involved with tackling some of those harder to reach vulnerable groups, like inclusion of people with disabilities? And how can we forge a partnership that ensures that markets are ensuring no one is left behind?
Thank you. Thank you, Kerry. We'll come back to that discussion shortly. Let me now turn to Joseph, and one can't help to be really inspired by the work that Joseph and his group are doing in Uganda. And I think during the Bellagio event, Joseph brought a bit of sort of reality to us all in the illustration of a woman who is disabled, her wheelchair's broken, she still has to farm. And the reality for her is crawling to her field. So, you know, this is a very big difference between some of the market thinking we're getting about. So, Joseph, I mean, can you bring us back to a little bit of what are some of the real realities and the real challenges at a field level that we really have to be thinking about when we're talking about this nice ideal of linking markets to the needs of the most marginalised and the poorest?
Thank you, Jim. You know, Uganda is one of those countries with probably the largest formulations of what you could call disabled people's organizations, linked to probably the way the government organizes itself, right through districts to sub-counties to villages. You'll find some form of government structure, and that is mirrored by disabled people's organizations. So in Uganda, probably wherever you go, to a village, to whatever location, you'll find a semblance of a structure of people with disabilities. But linking that to the research that we did, and particularly to what Jody has pointed to, the role of collective movements, and in my job as country director who spends a lot of time with those organizations, I began to reflect on what exactly that finding means, collective movements and economic empowerment for people with disabilities through the lens of disabled people's organizations. And I began to think to myself that, wait a minute, people with disabilities in Uganda have probably achieved the greatest amount of direct political representation compared to many other parts of the world, because they are represented at every level of government, and it could follow that every level of decision making. And one could say that political decisions being made in Uganda today, we can discuss the quality of those later, have an input of people with disability. And the question is, but then why don't economic decisions equally mirror the interests of people with disabilities? And I think that's where the real challenge and opportunity lies. The challenge, the opportunity is that these disabled people's organizations exist. They have the trust, the respect, the intimacy of their members. But the question is that how do they translate their political capital into economic representation, into economic inclusion, into market inclusion? And I think I've been reflecting a lot about that and probably can't find many answers. But I'm told that most of you here are innovative people in your own ways. And I want to link to a critical statement that Jim Kim made probably yesterday in the opening, and it will be my takeaway. He said, innovation should be all about linking people's aspirations to opportunities. So people with disabilities, through disabled people's organizations, aspire to be included at all levels in markets, to partake of the development that there is. And we as innovators, you as innovators, the challenge I have to you, advise me, what do I take back to them as the game changers for them to use their political capital to engage all these systems to become more inclusive? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Joseph. In the Bellagio event, I think we were really challenged by this whole question of seeing many good local examples, but how do you take that to scale? If you like, the idea of going from little islands of success to seas of change. And a very important discussion was saying, on one hand, one felt that you had a whole group of people working on market-based solutions, and in another world, you had a whole group of people working on rights and social movements. And sometimes those being different worlds that didn't necessarily connect, didn't necessarily support each other in the right sort of way. And so behind that was the idea about what's needed to connect those different worlds, what's needed to try and drive the larger scale of change to really use markets to benefit those living in the sorts of conditions that Rima and Joseph have described. And also recognising that's really very important reasons for this, people's own economic empowerment, but political reasons, security reasons, and that this is something that at a global level we really need to be taking seriously if we want to get to some of the issues behind achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So what we'd like to do for a few minutes now is ask you to have a little discussion at each of your tables. What have been some of your experiences in this space? Perhaps what are some of the key questions? What do you see as perhaps some of the real opportunities? And coming back to Joseph's comment, we've got a lot of great minds in this room with probably a lot of experience in innovation and change processes. If you really wanted to take this whole agenda forward, what would be some suggestions and ideas and thoughts that you might have about creating the scale of change that's needed to benefit the groups of people that we're talking about? So let me give you 10 to 15 minutes. We'll see how the discussion's going, to have a discussion at each of your tables, come back with some inspirational ideas, some challenges, some perspectives that you think might help to take this agenda forward. Enjoy a discussion with each other. Thank you. I guess we've just sort of started a discussion. I was snooping around at a few of the tables and some very interesting discussions starting to unfold. We spent a whole week discussing this issue in Bellagio last year, so I guess we're being a bit mean here in trying to get all this sorted in a half-hour discussion. But with that said, what are some of the thoughts? What are some of the discussions you've been having at the table? But particularly, perhaps what are some of the transformational ideas you think that could really maybe help to take the ideas of markets to impacting a much larger group of people in these circumstances? Over here. Please, yes.
Thank you. We actually didn't discuss much. We spent the time introducing each other and so on and so forth. But I have a very strong opinion on this subject because my experience is in the private sector in Uganda. I'm lucky to have the same name as your panelist.
Yes.
So I don't want to, as a disclaimer, I may not share his ideas. Oh, I may, my thinking is this. In most of these countries, there is a vibrant private sector in place. You have local associations that are struggling but are fairly well established. They know how businesses work. Increasingly, a lot of organizations are interested in how market approaches can work, particularly in the developing world. My advice, because in Uganda, over the last 10 years, I've worked with business associations. I head an association of over 4,000 small businesses. So my advice would be a good way to go about this, particularly when you talk about collective action, when you talk about advocacy, when you talk about all these things, please find a place of engagement with these local associations. Avoid duplicating. If you have village savings groups, for instance, and so on, as they mature, let them go and join these big associations. They are better at that job, and they would help these initiatives to mature into proper businesses. Thank you.
So what do you think is needed to make that connection better? What are the barriers to those connections happening at the moment in the Ugandan context?
Well, I sometimes think that, I mean, I don't want to choose anyone, but I sometimes think that we look at it differently. From a business association perspective, I'm happy to have as many businesses join me as possible. For me, it's about numbers. Sometimes from the NGO perspective, it's about funding. We want to show some results so that we get our next round of funding. So if I have 10 groups that I've supported, I want them to stay with me. I don't want to let them go and join and get support from other places. So I think from the development angle, I would encourage us to, at some point, let go. If you've worked with a business for 5 years, you don't tell them we have incubated you enough. Go to a bank and get a loan. No more grants. If you've been offering simple business training, at some point, let them go. That's my opinion.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I think I'll try to synthesize what I think was a pretty good discussion over here. On the high level, there were 4 things that kept coming up as we went around the table. 1 is instilling confidence. 2 is promoting networks. And then after you've promoted those networks, or maybe before promoting those networks, find ways to find consistency and establish standards. So both whether you're trying to plug somebody into a microfinance opportunity or a finance opportunity or into a value chain for a corporate, the relationship isn't broken by inconsistency. And then the last was, help me if I'm wrong, but something around technology and using technology to leveraging technology to promote the marketing of whatever the efforts are that are trying to happen. Because far too often there are these efforts that don't even fall on deaf ears, they never fall anywhere. And so just trying to think through the mechanisms for promoting that. Did I get that for us?
So who does this sort of work? And where does responsibility fit for civil society organisations? Where does it fall with business responsibility?
Listen, I mean, I think everybody has that a little bit personally, and everybody has a ton. But I mean, from my lens, it's around connectivity and to some stretch, right? You can't. It's very hard to distribute PDFs, right? It's very hard to distribute concepts and white papers and boards and things like that. But I do think that we're finding all over the world that if you give people internet access, right, and once you have that internet access, they start to find things on their own. I think that's really, really important. I mean, it goes back to that network opportunity as well, whether that's the network, as the gentleman from Uganda was just mentioning, you know, there are networks already there that can help with the distribution of the ideas and the opportunities that people have. And then whether it's the bank or the microfinance organization that presents itself and says, great, you know, work with that local organization and say, hey, these are the standards that we're looking for, right? And then we can help plug you in potentially to our commercial clients, or here's some microfinance opportunities. But at the end of the day, the internet seems to be, from my perspective, the equalizer of access to figuring out whatever you want to figure out.
Okay, so strengthening networks, a bit what John was saying, but also looking at the role that technology has in opening up those opportunities.
Stand up. Hi, Andrew Hunt from Aduna. So I think there was definitely a shared experience on this table, particularly from the agriculture and dairy industries, where we've seen a huge focus on supply and production, and really without much thought of the end market. And that's where we've seen a lot of failure, is a lot of projects encouraging production and supply without really having got proper market linkages in place, and leading to failure. And we kind of discussed that further, and one of the other things that came out of that was at the kind of regulatory and advocacy level as well, seeing how there are, at the policy level, there are protectionist policies, particularly within the EU, things like novel foods regulations, which have the impact that many of those production projects fail due to cheap imported subsidised products, or the inability to export them into the market. So I think a greater focus, commercial focus, and market-based focus when creating these projects would be very helpful.
And how do you do that?
Well, my business actually does do that.
Right.
Specifically, that's what we do. We actually we work with underutilized products that are abundant, like, for example, baobab fruit, and we actively create demand for them. So rather than focusing on the production and the supply side and financing lots of baobab fruit production facilities across Africa, which wouldn't be a great idea because there's a supply-demand imbalance. The thesis is by actually investing in demand creation within the market, as in within the global market, you can actually pull through that supply and actually move the demand curve through investing in the market side.
And do you mind me asking about what's been your experience working with the poorest and the most marginalised in this context? Have you found that it's possible to engage with that group in your business model?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And what's the key to that from your perspective?
Well, because we work specifically with, for example, baobab fruit, where baobab fruit grows is the kind of driest, remotest, and hence poorest regions of different countries in Africa. And the only way that you can access that supply or aggregate that supply is by working in partnership with local communities and community leaders. There's literally no other way you can do it. So yeah, that's how we managed to create value chain from rural Africa through to the global market.
Great. Okay, thanks. So where's Jody? Another good case study for you.
Yeah. Made notes.
Hi, I'm Ati Orku. My experience has been that not only the international markets, but there's a significant opportunity in the local markets that we may not be talking about. I work in Ethiopia with women that come from some of the poorest women in the country that we've provided training and credit to, and they serve the local markets. And with urban migration and population growth in most of African countries, for example, there's a significant need for products and services within their communities. So there's also that opportunity of making sure that people that we're working with are not only looking into selling their products for an international market, but also looking at the opportunities they have in their own backyards. And I think there's a significant opportunity there that we need to take advantage of.
Okay, thank you. What was the discussion on this? Oh, here.
So I'm Sally Walkerman from Small Foundation. We had an interesting conversation about programs that create business opportunities for the poorest, and particularly in remote areas. and some of the methodologies, particularly the UltraPort graduation methodologies that would combine business training and savings groups and sometimes some cash support, depends on the program. But a couple of things stood out. One was looking for business opportunities that are really viable for those for new entrepreneurs, and providing some coaching and support to make sure that businesses that people are starting are actually going to be profitable and responsible. So we talked about, you know, not cutting down hardwood to create charcoal as not a viable business, also not environmentally sustainable. So that was just one sort of obvious example. We also talked a bit about finding, and this it could be the entrepreneurs finding this, or programs or business associations or others, but looking for niches in the ways that markets aren't working, where you actually have a market opportunity that's not being exploited, so that it's not about sort of trying to create circumstances for the poorest and most marginalized to be pushing out someone else who's already working in a marketplace, because they're not very well positioned to do that, nor does that create sustainable change. But to look for untapped opportunities. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, but that comes back. Anita, was it? Ati, sorry. Ati's point about also looking for, really trying to understand more the opportunities that exist in local markets as well, and where there's particular niches there. Yeah.
Hello, so Vicky Clayton from Symmetrica. So we talked through how you actually start engaging the private sector, and through Rima's experience and also some Coca-Cola experience as well, and how actually it's about kind of demonstrating that there is a business opportunity, and kind of taking the risk yourself a little bit in the first like 3, 5, 7 years, to actually kind of build the foundations, and then the private sector will come if there is a business opportunity. Is there anything else anyone would like to add?
Okay. So if I'm understanding you correctly, there being a really important issue about what are some of the risks in working with these groups, and how does that risk get underpinned to make it viable for businesses to engage?
Yeah.
Did any other groups have sort of a discussion around some of these issues about what's the linkage with business and what makes it commercially viable and how you finance this sort of work?
We did.
Yeah?
We spoke about...
Sorry, we'll just get a mic to you because it's...
Wanjira Mathai with W Power. We spoke about the financing aspects, particularly with respect to cooking technologies and the demand, especially amongst the most marginalized, often women, to access cooking and lighting. I think there's been a lot of progress and lessons learned from the lighting sector on decosting through pay-as-you-go and pay-to-earn slowly. But in the cooking sector, the issue of cost remains a major, major barrier. And so how we get to access for the most marginalized is still an open question, because this is a sector where you're talking about $50 per stove for clean technology, when most cannot afford and rely on what is considered free firewood often. And so that is perhaps a big challenge still, but there were wonderful lessons from Rwanda and India, where there's some decosting going on, still challenging in terms of sustainability for the businesses, providing services for processing wood or grass into pellets, or offering technologies as an incentive for the transition. But still a lot to be learned.
Could you just explain to us what you mean by decosting?
Well, what I mean is essentially cutting the cost. And one of the greatest lessons out there is the mobile telephone. For a long time, nobody could afford a mobile phone except the most wealthy in most countries. Today, the most marginalized have a mobile phone. So where is that $7 cook stove that is as efficient and as efficient as perhaps the $500 phone. So you have that spread, which allows accessibility because of a cost issue, and you don't have that option in the cook stove sector.
Yeah, please, Rima.
Thank you. I'm back again. But I think I would just like to point out to what our friend from Uganda was saying, and also a lot of us, and just from my own experience of working with the poorest of the poor. And I think I'll talk about artisans. I get influenced with Jackie sitting next to me. And when we got the very first order from Zara to, make peacocks, which are black and white, and we had the samples made, the samples were approved, and 3 days later when I go to those very artisans, they had just put a tinge of blue and red in it. And I said, God, but the samples are right with you. And why did you put? And they said, people who have given the order doesn't know that peacocks are not black and white. So that's what the whole thing is, no matter what kind of business training you give them, it's the exposure to the market. And unless and until they know that where those black and white peacock embroidered shirts were going to be sold, it would not get registered to those very artisans. And so I think very often we organizations become too emotional, and so we start producing things and then think that the market will have to buy it. Yeah. But, how do you really work with the backward integration? So I think that's where, when I was talking about the supply chain, that you build your own supply chain, which, orients the producers to look at the market. So how do you have a market-based backward linkages that are worked out, and then try to work onto the forward linkages, be it with, I'm not talking that you just go and work with Zara. It just happened that we were fortunate enough, but then you could also work with the large retail chains in your own country. But that's what I mean to say, that, you need your own little supply chain that orients the producers. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's almost this dead horse, because whether you're going towards funding or you're going towards markets, right? It's about this consistency and making sure that you can't scale either way, right? Unless you can aggregate and get consistency, whether you're looking for a bunch of similar micro-entrepreneurs that somebody like Citi can make a large investment in and then distribute. And I think to that last point is just having intermediary quality assurance and making sure that those standards are done at the lowest level, which again goes back to that. I mean, it's a bit of a dead horse, but I think there is no way you can get that without that consistency and visibility on what's happening.
Great, thank you. I can see time ticking away. Let me pose another question to you just for our last 5 minutes. You've got a group of world business leaders and politicians in the room, and this is a group of very experienced social entrepreneurs. What are the key messages you'd be wanting to give that group about how to get markets to really work for the most marginalised and those living in extreme poverty?
So we talked about at our table, I think, inspired by Joseph's comment up on the stage, is that when you're trying to address a market gap, it's both a market issue and a rights issue, and that you're working both with the market and commercial solutions, but also including government in what you're trying to do as a representative of representing the rights of people and making sure that they're on board as well. And so I think often we try to come in with a very direct market solution and think that the market by itself will solve the problem. But I think that being aware of whether it's local associations or the local politics or the you need to be very aware and include all of those different players in the solution.
Debbie just here, and then Jeffrey.
My name's Debbie Hall, and I'm on the board of a group called Village Enterprise, who helps the very poorest in East Africa start small businesses. And so the early steps to this, from our perspective, are they need training, they need support and empowerment, they need to understand the basic concepts of sales and marketing. You know, I've got a retail kiosk, and Sally's got one as well. How do we differentiate our market? How do we provide better service to our customers so they come back to my stall and purchase from me again? So some of this is absolutely essential. We're working with people who've never run a business before, would never have taken out a loan. It's too risky. They don't have a business to apply it to. So fundamental business trainings, and along with that, confidence building in speaking, in having their voices heard together, you know, understanding where they fit within these small marketplaces and how to make them effective sellers of a variety of kinds of products and businesses. But the very poorest need building up. Both they need to fill up their knowledge base on how to run a business, and also their social capital, if you want to think of it as that way.
Thank you. I suppose there are people of sort of influence in this room. I suppose one of my sort of key messages here would never to assume that all marginalized communities are effectively to be clumped into one, because the needs of those different groups are very different. Partly I say this is one of the handful of wheelchair users in the building today, that often when people sort of talk about things like disability, a lot of people completely ignore the issue of physical infrastructure. Like it's all good, whatever process or whatever changes are in place, but if the roads are terrible, if there's no lifts, or if people can't afford wheelchairs, essentially everything else becomes a moot point. And I say this, you know, coming from London to Oxford today, everywhere had lifts. I sit in a 20,000 pound wheelchair, and all of these things that facilitate that to happen. And the issues that we cite here are completely different to maybe what other marginalized groups face. So I would just be cautious about clumping different groups all into one, and actually taking each of those groups as the problems that they individually have.
Thank you. A very critical point, and actually something we discussed, Joseph, I think quite a bit during the Bellagio event as well. So good reminder on that. Jeffrey.
Just related to what the last speaker said, I think we should definitely start with the user. So who are we trying to reach? And not all the poor are the same. There are a lot of different categories. So I think if you look at, you know, the women in rural Rwanda, for example, they're suffering greatly because they're having to collect firewood, and they're used to free firewood. But how do you reach them with services that they need and they want? And they're not interested in buying an expensive product. They're interested in cooking cheap, easier, smoke-free, things like that. So I think you should start with the user, and I think that's the message that politicians really need to get in their mind. It's because we end up looking at all the technologies, and is it a right product? Is it savvy? Or but I think we need to reach deeper. It's not just about the product. I think we should be agnostic about the product. I think we should look at financing. Is there financing for local talent? Are they getting the opportunities that a lot of expat companies are getting? Are local banks doing their job? So politicians, please pressure the funding sources. A lot of the international funding sources, they're members of these local banks. And so pressure them to get into solar, just like India has done in the past with segmented lending for the poor, for example, or for energy. And I think a lot of work has to be done with awareness building. So I would start with the user, and why isn't the user being served? And then work from there to is it a social barrier, it's financial, or is it technical?
A couple more comments, and then I'm afraid that I can't be greedy and take more time, so maybe we'll just take a few more comments and then we'll have to wind up.
So I'm not going to stand because I can't move my chair, but just to say really quickly, in a way following on from the last comment, you said start from where the user is, but I think it's also start from where the entrepreneur is, start from where the business is. So if the message is to government, and Rima will be able to speak to this more eloquently than I can, but so often government rules are either made in ignorance, assuming formality, assuming that everyone, all businesses are of a similar type, or intentionally made to stamp out small, informal, self-employed innovators that are creating some of the solutions that are needed in these communities. So changing the way regulators think about the self-employed informal sector would be one of the key messages.
Thanks. One of the lessons we have learned in my experience in Guatemala, in Central America, is that we as producers must balance production, exposure to market, as Rima said, with political action, transforming the rules. One of the fronts we are working in is with very poor people in dry areas, receiving for many years food assistance. And we started to transform the rules on how this food assistance is given. Not by government and corrupt-led industrial-based food packs, but trying to improve the local capacities, and that the groups that are needing the food, they are empowered to carry out the selection process and to interact with neighbor producers association to have this public expenditure on food assistance, increasing and empowering the local economy. So we are pushing those barriers, gaining people self-confidence during the process. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And maybe one last comment back there, David.
Just briefly, kind of building on Jodie's point, informality is the question I'd love to hear how people are dealing with. For the most marginalised, is the informality against the market is a problem we're finding. And just to make the point, in addition to Jodie saying informal businesses, getting better regulation and understanding of where they are, labour market solutions. Most of the marginalised are really going into labour markets. They're coming in as home workers, very informal. How can we bring a level of regulation and recognition into that labour markets for these populations? Not seeing a great focus on that at the moment. So industrialisation policies alongside others.
Great. And then a very quick last comment, Rima.
I think I'll just pick up from what Jodie and our last commentator said, was that I think our experience shows that it's a process, and it needs an investment of 5 to 7 years. So when I say investment, it's a grant, but it leads to building informal sector workers, enterprises. And I think what is needed is that how can the informality move into the markets? What's the framework? What's the policy framework that enables? Very often we end up saying formalizing the informal, but that's not what we are looking for. What the policy framework is needed is how can the informal move into the mainstream markets. And I think that's the framework we all need to really work on, and that's where the innovations will have to come from, whether it's in the cooking sector or it's in the agriculture, dairy, or craft sector. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rima. Joseph? Sorry, can we have a mic here? Oh, is your mic? Sorry, you've got a mic on, Joseph, so they can probably hear you anyway.
Thank you. And listening to the discussions here, linking back to what Jim Kim said yesterday, and forgive me, I'll cite him a lot because it's the first time I was too close to him. He talked about the need for intermediaries to have the capacity to be able to link people's aspirations to opportunities. And if I could think about the organization that I work for, ADD or AD International, as an intermediary for people with disabilities, in this room I recognize that probably I take away a learning for myself that I need, or we in our organization as an intermediary need to educate ourselves a lot more about engaging with the profit sector. Because I think in our work of articulating issues of people with disabilities, we are used to the non-profit sector. And why I emphasize this is because I'm inviting an offer for somebody who wants to be my mentor on this aspect, because I definitely need to take it forward. And because I need the skills to engage with my colleague from Uganda on a more informed point of view than I did. And I think I'll be requesting Abby to get his contact so that I can keep in touch with him. But still, that leaves the question begging. How do we, if I could say, tame the profit drive of the private force sector? How do we give the whole profit aspect a humane character to be able to be that sensitive, that inclusive? And as I say that, without necessarily appealing to the charity experience that I have, leaving it within the market-driven arena. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Joseph. And look, thank you to all of you being here this morning to have an opportunity to put this really critical issue on the table at SCOL. There's this document sitting on the table, which is Leave No One Behind. It outlines some of the key issues that came out of the Bellagio discussions last year, and it's called a global call to action as well. And I think what we've heard this morning is also about the critical need to get innovative new partnerships, to build networks, to better understand markets, to find ways of de-risking some of the challenges for both business and the poor engaging, and really to build some of the capabilities. So it's been very much a start of a discussion. Please, those of you who would like to join us, Claire will explain the lunch exercise. And please work with us all in how we continue to push this agenda globally. Claire.
Yes, just quickly. Our panellists. So we would love some or all of you to join us at 12 o'clock in the West Wing Dining Room 2 to take some of these areas of discussion forward. And apparently you can get your lunch in West Wing Dining Room 1, so it's all very close and it's one floor up. Can I just stress, I think one of the things that you've heard very clearly from everybody is and I think one of our speakers over in the corner said connectivity is key. At International, this work was the result of connectivity between organisations that some had worked together before, others not, and very significantly supported by Rockefeller. But to make progress, as Carrie said, towards the SDGs, this is absolutely a vital piece of work, and it's moving us on from how do we create entities that create profit to how do we do something even bigger, which is how do we make markets work. And the work looked at this through the lens of disability. So while it may not always be, and is very often not appropriate to put marginalised peoples in one large frame, what we learnt from looking at this through the lens of disability did seem to be very relevant, and some of Jodie's work backed this up, to other marginalised communities. So we hope you'll have a chance to read what we've left on the table. Thank you very, very much for making the time to be here. We're really delighted that so many people came. Please stay in touch. Let me have your details if you'd like to hear more about what we're doing. We're around. We can meet with you at different times. But mainly I just wanted to say thank you very much.
The friends and the women as well. It's just a one line. It's અમે પાર કરીશું, અમે પાર કરીશું, અમે પાર કરીશું એક दिन. ઓહો ઊંડા અંતરમાં અમને છે વિશ્વાસ, અમે પાર કરીશું એક दिन. We shall overcome someday. Deep in our hearts, we do believe that we sisters and brothers from the marginalized community, we shall overcome. Thank you so much.